Jan, are there any 20th century Czech authors of any significance?
Well, it's interesting. Some Czech scholars have been looking at what actually makes it in the outside world from Czech literature. And it is true that what is actually included in canonic literature, in the kind of international literary canon, is very haphazard. And I mean, it's totally coincidental. Yet there are some authors that if you stop a British person in the street, they will usually mention. One of them is Jaroslav Hashek with The Good Soldier Švejk. Then Karel Čapek was very popular in the interwar period. What nobody knows is that Czech literature in the interwar period has wonderful poetry, but of course that poetry is locked into the exotic Czech language, and I can't persuade anyone about how absolutely marvelous it is. But it exists, and it's a very original tradition. Starts with a typical, with a very idiosyncratic Czech movement in the 1920s. Poetism develops into surrealism, and then there is very, very intense personal lyrical poetry by a number of authors. After all, Jaroslav Seifert won the Nobel Prize for Literature.
What about post-war Czech literature?
It is really authors of the 1960s. The 1960s was a period of liberalization when people used literature, culture, film as an instrument to push towards freedom. And quite a lot of authors basically cut their teeth, as it were, in the 60s. Almost everyone knows the name of Milan Kundera, who used to be an enthusiastic supporter of Stalinist communism in the 1950s, but really his eyes opened later on, and he became a kind of prophet of writing about unknowability of the world and the human existence. Very agnostic author, and he certainly published very well-known short stories, Laughable Loves, which you still will find in any bookshop in Britain, the novel The Joke, and then after the Soviet invasion, when he was forced to leave, he now lives in France, he became quite famous with novels such as The Unbearable Lightness of Being in not only Britain, but the world, the whole world over. But of course there were other authors, like the late president, playwright Václav Havel, the author of absurd dramas from the 1960s onwards, Bohumil Hrabal, the lover of pubs and pub talk, who developed a very, very intense idiosyncratic style and who can be seen as a prophet of the Czech national traumas of being subjugated and hating it. And then, of course, Josef Škvorecký, the specialist in English and American literature, who, again, also started in the 60s from the short stories, and then, after he left Czechoslovakia, ended up as a well-known Canadian author, and wrote a number of books which are trying to, again, deal with the traumas of the 20th century, creating vast panoramas of 20th century European and American life.
Why should we read Hashek?
Hashek's Good Soldier Švejk, which was written in the early 1920s, has become an archetypal anti-war novel. The main protagonist, one ordinary, totally ordinary person, Josef Švejk, becomes caught up in the murdering machinery, war machinery of the First World War. He really lives in a region where only compulsion and prohibition is valid. He can't really live. I mean, this is a murdering machine. And basically the novel provides a recipe what to do when you find yourself in such a situation. He fights by talking. This seems to be a very important Czech tradition. You negate the natural reality by creating your own virtual world of anecdotes. And if these anecdotes are so boisterous and so intense, you can survive on the basis of this. Talking, people talking, is actually really a metaphor of art, isn't it? And this seems to be a typical Central European idea, that you can somehow shield yourself or protect yourself before oppression, before death, by using art.
What has survived of Čapek?
Karel Čapek was a very popular author in the United Kingdom in the interwar period. His output is quite considerable. He wrote things of many different genres, and of course his kind of popular stuff, he was a journalist amongst other things, his popular stuff was very well loved. He was a lover of little things, for instance, he wrote a book, he was a keen gardener, he wrote a book called Gardener's Year, and if you go to any library you'll discover that in the interwar period this book came out maybe in 15 different imprints in English. It was incredibly popular. But of course he was also a very serious author. Primarily I would say was he a science fiction author? He certainly uses science fiction themes, usually of a world-shattering technological invention, which highlights the precariousness of human existence. It shows that human nature is actually very finely balanced between emotion and reason, and emotionality or blind forces of business sort of take us to the very edge of the chasm of disaster. And so his novels are quite catastrophic. But it is really quite interesting in a way that some of these novels seem incredibly topical. I don't know, if you read The War with the Newts, which was written in the late 1930s, and it was really a warning against Hitler's fascism, Hitler's Nazism, you will discover so many topical things. Karel Čapek seems to have known very well the world of international diplomacy, international political selfishness, idiocy of scientific discourse, stupidity and corruption of journalists. And it's all there. And even though it's a novel from the 1930s, it feels incredibly modern, incredibly topical. And of course, that novel is very much based on irony. And that is what carries Čapek through there.
What is most significant about Kundera?
Cynics will say, and they have said it, that Kundera is a sellout because it's basically pornography. There's a lot of sex in it. Kundera actually uses sexual encounters for probing the essence of the human condition and for examining our psychological states and how we actually analyze reality, what we do, how we read what's around us. So the theme of how we actually read the world seen through sexual relationships is very important for Kundera. It starts with The Laughable Loves in the 1960s, goes through The Joke, which is really about Stalinist politics, but Kundera called it a love story when he wanted to put off journalists who were confronting him with the issue of Stalinism and politics. He said, come on, it's only a love story. And then in the 1980s, and even in Immortality in 1990, he always starts with the analysis of what sex means and sexual encounters for his protagonists. But of course, his protagonists are not really living people. They are the embodiment of his ideas. So he's trying to communicate something to the general public. It's a kind of philosophical novel, what he's trying to do. He was very much influenced by the French author Diderot. So he's kind of coined a new type of writing, as he would call it, when he uses fiction, narrative, to communicate philosophical ideas. That is a typical characteristic feature of his later writing. Certainly even his latest novel, Ignorance, which is about the experience of the Czechs abroad and what happens when they come back to the Czech Republic after the fall of communism. And the leitmotif is that what you haven't experienced, you will not be able to communicate.
Has Czech literature produced anything significant since the fall of communism?
Well, there's a bit of a problem. When Petr Bílek of Charles University, professor of Czech literature there, sort of talks about three stages of post-communist development of literature in Czechoslovakia. First, there was this wave of banned literature over the ages, over the 4 or 5 decades, which flooded the bookstores, and of course people were glutted. People couldn't actually absorb it properly, especially since these previously banned books actually dealt with periods which now seemed irrelevant, because people were at the beginning of a totally new era. So why read about communist oppression when democracy has returned? Then there was, according to Bílek, the next stage was the expectation that some great new talents would appear, but in freedom. But this doesn't seem to have realized. And then quite cynically, the last stage, according to Bílek, is that what you have now is shameless marketing manipulation, that you have one-day wonders, that the media discover literary celebrity, and this celebrity tops the headlines for a couple of weeks and then disappears. So I don't know, this is a very jaundiced view. I still think that there are interesting authors that have come out since the fall of communism over the past 20 years, even though they are not maybe so significant as in previous decades. I think actually the shift has moved a little bit towards cinema. I think Czech cinema now is much more significant, telling us about what the Czech Republic is about, or the human condition in post-communism. Nevertheless, there are several authors. Michal Mráz is an interesting postmodernist author specializing in these fantasy landscapes in books, within books. Then Emil Hackl is somebody I particularly value because even though his stuff is kind of psychedelic, and again there's a lot of sex and a lot of bizarre encounters, there is some influence of Hrabal in his writing, he seems to have the knack to actually capture very, very intensely the atmosphere of current Czech Republic. I particularly like his collection of shorter texts of flying objects from the beginning of 2000s, which basically gives us short stories which tell us exactly what the situation, what people think, and how people behave in contemporary Czech Republic. A film was made of earlier Hackle's novel called Of Children and Parents. The novel is trying to access the traumatic history of the 20th century, seen from Central Europe, through the eyes of a 40-year-old man who's communicating with his 70-year-old father. And it's interesting that this film has been on release in America and has been quite successful there. And the English translation of the book has actually sold some thousands of copies in the United States as a result. Then, of course, there is the commercial author, which is his own self-deprecating name, Michal Mráz, who's published about 20 novels from the life of Prague yuppies. Over the past 20 years, he's highly successful. These are kind of novels like what we have in Britain, the Bridget Jones Diaries. Not much of it, understandably, has been translated into English, although Vivek has been translated into about 20 different European languages. I wouldn't be so negative about Vivek, because even though there's a lot of sex and the books are entertaining and they are well readable and often quite banal, nevertheless there are texts where he plays very interestingly with meta-language, meta-literary levels, and actually he, I think, can be quite a sophisticated craftsman. So that is, in a nutshell, everything about the current Czech literary scene.